He holds senior positions at the University of Exeter and in the Met Office. I'm not going to give him too big of a blurb because I want him to speak. So without further ado, Rich, over to you.
Thanks, Robert. Okay, thanks, Rob. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak. I'm excited for two reasons, actually. First of all, I'm a huge fan of BIFoR. You do amazing work here. It's just brilliant. Secondly, it's nice to come back to Birmingham. I did my master's course here in meteorology and climatology in the Muirhead Tower 30 years ago in the geography department. So thank you for the invitation to speak. So Rob gave me a very interesting piece of homework for this. He said, can you do a talk on the world's forests in 2100. Of course, we can't really predict what the world's forests will look like at the end of the century, but we can think through some of the ways which they may be altered, both through our own impact through land use and through climate change itself, which of course we are driving through burning fossil fuels and through deforestation. So I'm going to spend about 20 minutes or so talking through what we do in the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I've been an author on 3 of the assessment reports for that. I'm going to talk about what we do to characterise future climate and impacts on forests and the drivers of land use as part of the emission scenarios that drive climate change. So this is all basically in model world, global model world, mainly Earth system models. So an Earth system model is an atmosphere and ocean and biosphere biogeochemistry model. So the atmosphere part of the Earth system model used at the Met Office is actually the same model that's used for the weather forecast you see day to day. So that uses the equations of fluid dynamics and thermodynamics to model the physics of the atmosphere, the effect of the greenhouse effect, increasing carbon dioxide or the greenhouse gases and so on, the change of state of water from liquids to water vapor, freezing water, the water cycle, evaporation, precipitation, and how that is affected by the land surface and the vegetation characteristics, including the world's forests, which themselves are modeled using fairly long established principles of plant physiology and some somewhat simplistic representations from population biology about competition between different plant functional types. We don't try and represent every single species of plant by any means. We represent the world's vegetation in terms of plant functional types. So broadly 5 categories of trees, different combinations of evergreen and deciduous, broadleaf and needleleaf, and temperate, boreal and tropical tree species. And then C3 and C4 grasses and crops and shrubs as well. So this simplistically represents the global vegetation in a way which we can plug into our atmosphere model to affect both the uptake of carbon from the atmosphere and the release of carbon back to the atmosphere, and affect the physical characteristics of the land surface, how much sunlight is absorbed by the landscape, the albedo, the reflectivity of the landscape, how much water is evaporated, how much transfers energy, and so on. So there's atmosphere and land components, and also the oceans are included as well. Again, the fluid dynamics of the oceans. And this is all calculated at tens of thousands of grid points across the Earth on dozens of layers in the atmosphere and into the ocean. Calculations are done representing every 30 minutes, and we will simulate this for centuries, back the last 150 years or so, and on into the future for 100 years or more. So we can try and explain past climate change and make assessments of future climate change with different assumptions of what we're doing with deforestation and burning fossil fuels. So a very, very simple cartoon of how forests are impacted in these Earth system models. So I'm just going to consider the direct effect of people on the forest and the ecosystems and the effect of climate. But of course, these are interlinked in various ways. So we, the people on Earth, are also emitting greenhouse gases, as I mentioned, CO2, nitrous oxide, methane, and so on. That is driving climate change. Our impact on the forest and ecosystems is also releasing greenhouse gases, particularly CO2. which in turn is driving more climate change, but also responds to climate change and responds to the change in atmospheric composition, particularly CO2, of course. And of course, that's a focus of BIFoR, the response of forest ecosystems to CO2, of course. And climate is affecting ecosystems and it's affecting us in human society. So you've got all these interactions, you've got uncertainties in every part of this. So there's many different ways this could play out in the future. So how do we possibly cut through this and get some kind of sense about what we think future forests might look like around the world? Well, I'm going to break it down into two sets of scenarios: the socioeconomic scenarios, the scenarios of human futures, and the climate scenarios. I'll cover the human and socioeconomic scenarios first of all. So some of you may have heard this term, SSPs, the shared socioeconomic pathways. These different sort of storylines of global society, the global economic and geopolitical landscape over the coming century. It's characterized in different ways. There's two key indicators shown on the graphs here, which is population and gross domestic product per capita, so a measure of wealth, if you like. And the five different scenarios here, numbered from 1 to 5, they're given these sort of slightly pithy names, from sustainability down to fossil fuel development, with different ones in the middle. So the sustainability one, SSP1, the green line, assumes a population which peaks in the middle of the century and then declines globally. And in the lower chart, a reasonably wealthy world at the end of the 21st century, not the most wealthy, but there's the GDP does go up. The richest world is the fossil fuel development world, SSP5, but that also assumes a peak and decline in population. The red line, which has an ongoing increase in population, SSP3, so-called regional rivalry, that's a fairly kind of unpleasant world when you look into the details of it. There's a lot of poverty, and it's not particularly a pleasant world, but it does drive high emissions, as does the fossil fuel development world. And I'll give some more details of some of these in a few slides' time. These scenarios get used in another class of models called integrated assessment models, which combine global economic models and sometimes simple climate models and land use models to characterize the human future to drive our emissions scenarios for the global climate models. And this chart here is showing the results from one of these models called IMAGE, which is showing the projected changes in land use. On the left, it's the present day fraction or area of different categories of land use, dark green being forests for 2010, so 10 years out, 12 years, 13 years out of date now. On the right, it's 5 different bar charts showing how these are projected to change by the end of the century. I'm afraid I've cut off the y-axis on the right-hand chart. The horizontal lines are 200 million hectares each. So the increase in forest in SSP1, the dark green, is about 350 million hectares by the end of the century. That's the only one which has an increase in forest cover by the end of the century. All the rest have a decrease in forest cover by the end of the century. SSP3, forest cover declines by about 500 million hectares by the year 2100. So these are two polar opposite scenarios in terms of forests. And the reasons for these, there's several reasons. So I'm not going to give all the SSPs now. I'm going to just focus on these two extreme ones as far as land use is concerned, the forest, SSP1 and SSP3. So one is highly globalized, the sustainability one is highly globalized, whereas the regional rivalry one is less globalized. One has a reduced preference for animal products, one has more preference for animal products. You've got strict versus little regulation, high versus low yields in crops, improvements, high versus low efficiency in livestock systems, so how land is used for animals, and high effectiveness versus low effectiveness in terms of the use of land for climate change mitigation, so removing carbon from the atmosphere. So in the SSP1 sustainability world, they care a lot about the environment. They want to reduce carbon from the atmosphere, use the land a lot as part of that, and reduce their land use for animal agriculture, amongst other things. And SSP3 is the opposite. So what does this look like in terms of the global maps of forest cover by the end of the century in these two shared socioeconomic pathways? SSP1 on the left, the sustainability one. As you might expect, there's a large increase in forest cover in many areas. So green is an increase in forest cover, orange and red is a decrease in forest cover due to deforestation or conversion to other land uses. So much of the temperate world, or most of the temperate world, many of the areas which are currently cultivated at the moment are returned to forests in SSP1. Some of the tropics as well, but there's some parts of the tropics that still see a further deforestation because there's still the need to feed a growing population. But SSP3 projects ongoing deforestation over the temperate regions and the tropical regions. So two very different futures of forests when you're just thinking about the socioeconomic impacts here. Importantly, this is not yet including any impacts of climate change. It's only the direct human impact. So what about the climate scenarios? So again, there's many different ways this could play out. There's many different levels at which CO2 could build up in the atmosphere by the end of the century, many different ways in which the global temperature could respond to that, many different ways in which the regional patterns of rainfall could respond to that. So many different climate futures. So again, we try and break it down into a few sort of simplistic representative scenarios. This chart shows the projected change in global surface temperature relative to the end of the 19th century from a whole set of different climate models. There's a huge project called CMIP6, the sixth coupled model, that's coupled atmosphere, ocean, biosphere model, intercomparison project. So several dozen models from around different centers around the world now, not only the Met Office, but many countries in the world have their own global climate models now. And these are used together under a common modeling framework to make projections of climate change out to the end of the century, using different what-if scenarios of the buildup of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, so CO2 and other greenhouse gases, quantified in terms of the radiative forcing, numbers on the right, with 8.5 watts per square meter. That's the change in the greenhouse effect, the change in the perturbation to the Earth's energy balance. That's a very, very large perturbation to the Earth's energy balance, 8.5. That would be a huge increase in the greenhouse effect, which would require a massive buildup of CO2 and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Probably more than we'd expect from an ongoing scenario of where we are going in terms of current fossil fuel and deforestation, but it could happen if there was strong feedbacks in the system, or if we decided to go back to burning more coal and even more oil and so on. So we're not on the 8.5 trajectory right now, but it may happen if we change direction economically or if we have strong feedbacks. At the other end of the scale, the 1.9 watts per meter squared radiative forcing, that's what we would need to limit the greenhouse gas buildup to if we want to meet the Paris Agreement's international target of limiting global warming to well below 2 degrees, ideally 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial. So that would require a very limited input of CO2 and other greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. So we're currently at about, we've exceeded 400 parts per million of CO2 at the moment. We'd need to stay not too far above that to keep the radiative forcing to 1.9 watts per square meter. 8.5 watts per square meter would need about 1,000 parts per million of CO2. So that gives you an idea of the range compared to what you're looking at in the FACE experiment at BIFoR. So we've got these two sets of scenarios. You've got the socioeconomic scenarios, different human futures, and then the climate scenarios characterized by the level of radiative forcing, the level of greenhouse gas buildup, if you like, which map roughly onto different levels of global warming. And I'll come onto that later on. But there's not a single way of mapping a particular human future onto a particular climate future, because a certain level of buildup of greenhouse gases could arise from several different human futures. So these boxes here show different ways in which these could be matched onto each other, but some can be ruled out. So the sustainability scenario, SSP1, that's not compatible with a very high level of radiative forcing, a very high level of climate change. It's more likely to be at the very low end, 1.9 or 2.6 levels of radiative forcing. At the other end of the scale, on the top right, the fossil fuel development scenario, that's not compatible with a very low level of climate change. Obviously, we've been putting more CO2 into the atmosphere. So we pick a few kind of representative combinations throughout this possible matrix And we look at 5 different combinations in the IPCC, the most recent IPCC report anyway. I'm just going to narrow it down to 2 in a minute. I'll stick with 5 for the moment, going from the very high level of climate change down to the very low level. But these are the 5 different emissions scenarios where I looked at in the IPCC report. So this is now a chart of CO2 emissions in terms of billions of tons per year projected over the 21st century. The top one in the dark red, the SSP 8.5 scenario, so the fossil fuel development world, leading to a very rapid ongoing increase in CO2 emissions. As I said, that's above where we're currently headed at the moment, but it's considered as a worst case scenario for risk assessment purposes. We're probably closer to the dark red line, the SSP 370, in terms of where our emissions are heading. I'm not saying that shows where our geopolitical and economic futures are going, but in terms of the emissions, we're probably tracking that, maybe slightly below that at the moment, maybe somewhere between that and the 4.5 scenario. If we believed all the pledges that the world's governments have promised so far, we should be tracking the SSP 4.5 scenario, which would decline emissions over the century. But we have to hold governments to account of their pledges. This is promises, not actual action. In terms of what's actually happening, we're closer to the 7.0 scenario. But where we want to be is at the low end, limiting global warming to well below 2 degrees under the Paris Agreement. So this 2.6 and 1.9 scenario. And importantly, in terms of forest and land use, the very lowest line, the light blue, you can see the emissions actually go negative by the middle of the century. This is what's meant by net zero. So emissions are becoming zero, then the offset of actual emissions by uptake, either by natural ecosystems or by technological removal, is balancing out by 2050. After that, we're actually actively removing CO2 from the atmosphere in this scenario. It's not known whether this is actually possible or not, but it suggests that this is needed to limit warming to well below 2 degrees. So we explore these kind of scenarios in order to see what we need to do to limit warming to very low levels. And this is where the important role of land use comes in, because we're taking a lot of carbon into the world's ecosystems, as well as removing a lot of it through technological purposes, if these can be scaled out sufficiently largely. So the future climate change projections that go along with these, at the 2 ends of the scale, on the left, we've got 1.5 degrees global warming. So this is the sort of stretch target of the Paris Agreement. We're trying to avoid going above that. In reality, we're probably going to exceed that in about 10 years' time. We may exceed it temporarily, potentially even this year, if we have a very large El Niño event, but that wouldn't count as breaking the Paris Agreement, because that refers to long-term warming. But this is probably the least we can expect, basically, 1.5 degrees global warming. 2 degrees global warming is the upper limit of what's acceptable under the Paris Agreement. 4 degrees global warming could easily happen at the end of the century if we keep emitting at current rates, especially if feedbacks in the system are strong. And that could happen with the SSP 370 scenario, which I spoke about earlier, the second highest scenario. SSP 119 on the left is what's needed to limit warming to 1.5. But you can see the global pattern of temperature is not uniform. We warm more over the land and warm more at the poles, because the melting of ice and snow exposes the dark underlying ocean and land surface, and so more sunlight is absorbed from space, and that causes more warming. So we get more warming in certain parts of the world, but it's warming everywhere. But in terms of the water cycle, the pattern's more complicated. This is showing projected patterns in soil moisture now from these CMIP6 climate models. I should emphasize at this point, this is the average over many different models. The average in some cases may indicate a small change, but it could be a cancellation of some models showing a large wetting and some showing us large drying. What we're showing here is the ensemble average. But you can see there's a picture of more likely to be wetter in some places, more likely to be drier in other places. Wetter in some of the northern parts of the world, drier in the Mediterranean, drier in much of South America, for example, Southern Africa, wetter in Central Africa, wetter in the Indian subcontinent, for example. And these patterns get stronger at high levels of global warming. And these will obviously have a huge impact on the world's ecosystems, including forests. So what happens when when the forests and the world's ecosystems are allowed to respond to this and the temperature and the CO2 in the Earth system models? So this is what happens in one particular Earth system model, which is the UK Earth system model. So collaboration between the Met Office and various UK universities and NOAA research institutes. This is the projected pattern in tree cover by the end of the century, with the SSP1 1.9 scenario on the left and the SSP 370 scenario on the right. So on the left, that is about 1.5 degrees global warming. On the right is about 4 degrees global warming, actually more than 4 in this particular model, but it's the high end versus the low end that we're looking at here. And the green is an increase in tree cover, and the orange and red is a decrease. And this is considering both climate change impacts and land use impacts as well. And as I said earlier, we've got 5 different tree types here in our plant functional types. This is combining them all, so it's the total change in tree cover. There's a lot more detail within this, hidden within this. But broadly speaking, in both cases, the model's projecting an increase in the temperate and boreal forest cover, but decreases in the tropics, various combinations of reasons. So in SSP 1.9, some of the increase, especially in the temperate regions, is due to the land use change, the proactive use of forestry as carbon sinks for climate mitigation. But there was still, if you remember, there's still some loss of forest in the tropics in that scenario. There's also climate change effects kicking in as well. But if we go to the SSP 370, the high climate change scenario and the high land use scenario on the right, there's larger changes. In particular, there's a larger decrease in tree cover in Central Africa. That was due to the direct land use impact there, rather than climate change itself. But in contrast, in Amazonia, there's a large decrease in forest cover there, and that is a climate change impact. So there's, in the most recent set of climate models, there's a consensus towards a drier Amazon, unfortunately. Luckily, not as much as our model in the Met Office used to predict about 20 years ago. The model I originally worked on in the 90s predicted this catastrophic dieback of the Amazon. You may have heard this term, Amazon dieback, Amazon tipping point. That particular model, it produced a very large warming and a very, very severe drought, because the sea surface temperature patterns in the Atlantic and the Pacific that conspired to change the wind flow across Amazonia to bring much less moisture into the Amazon. So we got these very large droughts. That doesn't happen in our new model. It doesn't happen in other models, but we still get some level of drying. So we're not saying that climate change will by itself destroy the Amazon now necessarily, but it's causing it to be drier, it seems. And when that interacts with deforestation, that's when you potentially risk this Amazon tipping point of a loss of forest. Because one of the points is that the Amazon forest creates its own rainfall by recycling the moisture. So if you start to lose the forest, you get less rainfall, and you can then get a loss of the forest uncontrollably. But it needs both deforestation and climate change for that to happen, it seems, in these models now. But it clearly is a risk to some level, even if it's not as severe as we used to think. And that happens at high levels of warming. But the increase in the boreal forests and the temperate forests, that's larger in the high scenario, partly because the warmer climate means there's a longer growing season, but also high levels of CO2 promote more forest growth in this model. I should also point out, coming back to the Amazon though, one of the reasons that we don't get a huge loss of forest in the Amazon, again, is because the forest in the model is responding to high levels of CO2. So if this was not the case, then there may well be a larger loss of forest in the Amazon and other areas of the tropics. So the two main conclusions from the IPCC Working Group 2, the impacts report that I worked on that came out last year, in terms of large-scale biome shifts, changes in global vegetation, at 4 degrees global warming, we could see 35% of global land shifting from one biome category to another. But that would be limited to less than 15% if we could limit warming to less than 2 degrees. So we could be seeing some profound changes in global vegetation, including global forests, especially at high levels of climate change. Or specifically, under the high warming scenarios, there is this risk of shifts of extensive parts of the Amazon rainforest to drier and lower biomass vegetation. Poleward shift to the boreal forest because of the warmer climate, and upslope shifts of montane forest into alpine grassland areas as well. And the IPCC traditionally puts confidence levels on these, and importantly, the medium confidence assigned to the Amazon Amazon dieback scenario, because as I say, a first order uncertainty there is how strong the CO2 response is of the tropical forest. Which brings me to my final point. This has all been in model world, but I wanted to bring it back to the real world and the work that you folks do here. The large scale experiments of the type that you do in BIFoR are absolutely crucial for informing the models that we work on. A lot of the principles that we're basing our current models on are maybe 20 years out of date. The plant physiology understanding, the plant structural responses and so on is largely based on laboratory scale experiments done in the 80s or even earlier than that. So we are relying on these large scale experiments like BIFoR FACE, the new Amazon FACE experiment that we're building in Brazil, which Rob and colleagues are helping us with. These are going to really help us understand whether our models are doing the right thing in terms of the response of large-scale ecosystems to high levels of CO2. Also, an important one for us is the drought experiment at Castanhar in Brazil, which has been artificially droughting several hectares of forest in the eastern Amazon for the last 25 years to see how the forest responds to the large drying the model's been predicting. There's many others like this, but I just wanted to finish by saying these are really, really important for informing the models. So please do continue with your work, and thank you for listening.
Thank you very, very much, Rich. I think that was a great, if slightly terrifying place for us to end. We have some questions that have come in on the Padlet, so I'll go through those. I'd like us to spend, if we can, about 10 minutes taking questions, having some discussion, and then there'll be just a few minutes of wrap up of the conference afterwards. So unless you've got very pressing transport deadlines, if I could just ask for a little bit of patience around that. Thank you very much. Raise my hand, so. Actually, I remember the first question. I remember the first question for Emma, which was about blue infrastructure, because you were emphasizing the green infrastructure. What about blue infrastructure in Birmingham for climate resilience?
Thank you for your question. I talk about green infrastructure because that's what I know about. In terms of blue infrastructure, I think one of the biggest benefits it provides Birmingham in terms of climate resilience is the fact that along the river channels within Birmingham, there has been limited development. And so we do have these kind of greenways and meadows that run along the river paths, and they are really great for providing somewhere where the water to flood to, and also to provide somewhere for people to go to when it's hot. In terms of what else is going on in terms of blue infrastructure in the city, I know there's a lot of work happening in the city centre, in the Smithfield area and Warner's Field. So kind of developing the area where the big markets used to be, and they're opening up the River Ray and creating sustainable urban drainage there, and kind of bringing greenery and water back into the city centre.
Thanks, Emma. And I think actually a question has just come in, but I think it's quite similar to, or we can wrap it into another question which has already come in, which is about the optimization of green space. So is there an optimal green space? What does this green space look like?
Oh, thanks for that question. So I have this vision where in the future, you look down from space and you can't see where our urban areas is, because we've created this metro nature, this idea that where we live in urban areas, they are urbanized, but we have green infrastructure on our roofs and on our walls and on our walks to school. And so that, I don't believe you can have too much nature and green space in an area. It's about finding a way for us to coexist. Yeah.
Thanks, Emma. Yeah. You might want to come back in response to similar questions that are coming in for Rich. Rich, there was a question that's come in about, is it just all about carbon, or do we need to think about the other parts of the energy budget with respect to forests and climate?
Absolutely, we do. Yeah. So I guess this is talking about the things like the albedo effect I mentioned earlier. So that does complicate matters, because if you've got an expansion of the boreal forest, for example, you can decrease the surface albedos, which has a local warming effect because absorbing more solar radiation. So that can be a positive feedback. So even if you've planted forests to take up carbon, you can inadvertently warm the climate by darkening the landscape. But then on the flip side, tropical forests tend to have more of an effect through increasing evaporation and increasing cloud cover, both of which tend to cool tropics. So on the whole, at the global scale, modelling work suggests that boreal forests warm their own climate through their effects on the land surface. Tropical forests cool their own climate. So they're moderating the extremes, basically. So I'm glad that question was asked, because it is a crucial part, and that is included in the models, actually.
Well, that's good. Thanks, Rich. And does that tie in, Emma, to the import in the urban sphere, thinking not just unidirectionally, so trees for carbon or trees for shade or trees for air pollution?
Trees for everything. I think in urban areas, so it's when you're thinking about the benefits that trees can provide us, it's really important to think about scale, because what trees in a forest can provide us is completely different than what one individual street tree can provide us. So in the city, I think it's important about thinking about trees for shade and for rainfall interception and for kind of for adapting to climate. Whereas when we think of trees on larger scales, it's more about thinking about how trees can mitigate and sequester carbon, which hasn't really answered your question, Rob, but I did talk around the topic.
Okay, very good. I'm going to swap topic very quickly, just firing questions at you one after the other. One for you, Rich, is about algae. So those other photosynthesizers.
So yeah, we do include a similarly simplistic ocean biosphere model in the Earth system models, which again I talked about the simplistic plant functional type approach on land vegetation, similar for marine ecosystems. So algae is sort of simplistically included, but I'm not sure if there's any work done on seaweed farming or anything like that, if that's where the question is going. But
maybe it's just the forest versus algae in terms of carbon. I don't know. I mean, maybe
if the person asks the questions in the audience, feel free to expand. But it clearly is a crucial aspect of it. I focused on the land part of the carbon cycle, but the ocean part of the carbon cycle is massively important.
I think we have to reluctantly agree,
and it probably does play some role in climate change mitigation if you can use seaweed farming and so on.
Yes, thanks very much, Rich. You did stick wonderfully well to your remit, which we gave you. It was very precise, and it was about the terrestrial carbon cycle and about forests. There is another question which is maybe stretching that remit for you, Rich, which is about future technology. So what role does plausible future technology play in the kind of scenario building that you've been telling us about?
So the very low emission scenarios that I talked about, which have this peak in decline of CO2, as I mentioned, that makes an assumption about an active net removal of carbon from the atmosphere in the second half of the century. It's not saying it's possible, it's kind of hoping it's possible. It may be possible. So this is not meant to be a prediction by any means, but it's trying to say, if we want to limit warming to low levels, we will have to be thinking about removing carbon. So we either need to be using land in an effective way to do that, thinking, of course, about the other uses of land for food and wilderness and so on, and also seeing if we can roll out and scale up these technologies which have been shown to remove carbon from the atmosphere but are not yet scaled up. yet to be proven whether it's possible or not. Of course, the fundamental thing is to stop putting carbon in the atmosphere altogether. If we
Yes,
can.
yeah, absolutely. Emma, do you want to say anything about future technological changes that are, in the urban setting that come into your thinking about climate vulnerability?
Gosh, help me out, Rob.
Well, changes in modes of transport, changes in the way that we build our city.
Yes, so I think we need to think about how, so actually I'm going to go a bit broader if that's okay, Rob.
Of course.
And I think it's not just about technology. I think it's about what everybody can do as individuals collectively, because if everybody does a little, we will have a really big impact together. So it's not necessarily about future technology or somebody finding the big solution. It's about thinking of when you can walk or cycle rather than drive a car, or when you can take a bus. It's thinking about when you can, it's thinking about where your food comes from. And if everybody makes these really small steps, then collectively they have a really huge impact. And the other thing that I think if everybody could do is water your street trees, because a lot of them are looking quite sad this year.
Okay, thanks, Emma. Yeah, so behavior change as much as technology change. That's great. I want to finish on the questioning, on the interrogation of our speakers, if I may, just with one final question for you both. It was directed at you first, Rich, and that is about the experimental or empirical unknowns. What you mentioned some right at the end, but do you want to just take a minute, or a moment, just to expand a little bit? What are you really looking for to advance the models in terms of experimental evidence?
Well, I guess first I'll reiterate what I said earlier about the large-scale CO2 response of land ecosystems is absolutely critical. It's a first-order uncertainty in these models. We literally get the opposite effect in tropical forest responses to climate change, whether we switch on or off the current representation of CO2 responses. As I said, that's very old, the way it's formulated. So we need to know whether it's doing the right thing. This is why BIFoR work in the FACE and the future Amazon FACE and other FACE experiments were really crucial, and other large-scale experiments. The other thing I haven't mentioned is wildfire. So that's not included in the model projection I showed. It is included in some. We really need to understand how that is affected by climate change, how it interacts with ecosystems and fuel loads and so on, which again is affected by CO2. And to bring it back more kind of to a UK scale rather than globally, though, wildfire is a climate risk that we are simply not prepared for in the UK. Earlier on this afternoon, we heard about the 19th of July last year, the surprise high temperatures. There was shocking wildfires. This is going to keep happening. We're not ready for it. We need to be more prepared for that, both from a practical perspective and from a scientific understanding perspective.
Thank you, Rich. And that very nicely rounds us back to discussions we were having earlier on today about wildfire and climate change effects. Emma, empirical evidence. What's missing? What's missing? Yeah. Do we need to get out there and use the city as a lab in the same way as we use the forest as a lab?
We absolutely need a BIFoR urban, Rob, if that's what you're asking me. So I just wanted to add very quickly on to Richard's comment about wildfires, because on the 19th of July, I remember standing outside and breathing in Birmingham's air through my nose, and it felt like I was in southern Spain. That was not British air. And in the distance, I could smell the fire at Lickey Hills, because Lickey Hills was burning that week, and it felt awful. It felt really dystopian. And that's why I think for me as a researcher, I intensely focus on what I can do and what we can all do to try and create our own future. So in terms of what we don't know in urban areas, really practical things like how much will a tree canopy intercept rainfall, and therefore how many tree canopies do I need to have in Birmingham to create an effective sustainable drainage system? How much cooling does a particular tree provide in terms of, if I had lots of them together, how much will it cool the surrounding neighborhood? So just really basic scientific information. And we can measure some of that stuff out at BIFoR FACE, because I have a master's student at the moment looking at rainfall interception. So, and I was quizzing William about his leaves and his tree canopy temperatures last night.
His hot leaves. Yes,
Yes.
that's very good. Thank you both very, very much. Thank you all online and in the room for your engagement in this session and in every session that we've had. I'm going to hand over to Sabrina just to close the conference. But to close this session, I just would like to ask you again to show your thanks to the speaker.
Thank you again for the speakers and for the people that presented their posters. And I think it's the time to announce the posters winners. I am very excited to announce the names because I'm very familiar with the names. I think Dee or Sam are bringing the prizes, okay? So, and if I am allowed to make another quick suspense for the winners, because two are from Rob Jackson's group and one from Estrella group. So also I would like to thank for the high quality of the posters presented, and we have lots of votes, over 70. Now I should go to the winners. So
sorry, I forgot. And thank you to New Phytologist for providing the prizes.
oh, yes. Thank you, Rob, for this. So we have the 3 posters winners, and the 3rd place is the poster entitled Effect of Health, Age and Location of the Chemical Composition of Ash Wood by Diana Ventura Villaraga. Hopefully I pronounced your surname correctly. And the 2nd place is the poster entitled Chemical Priming of Defense and Forest Health, Oak, Powdery Mildew Interaction by Rosa Sanchez Lucas. And the 1st place, the poster entitled Characterization of Bacteriophages that Infect Oak Pathogens by Emily Grace.
One more round of applause. Let's give you something to do.
Do you want to say something at the end? Maybe Andy as well?
Yeah.
Yes, right. So.
Okay, so I have the great pleasure of doing a few extra awards for our BIFoR volunteers. So our BIFoR volunteers, as coordinated by Deanne Brettle, get involved in all sorts of stuff at the Institute, from soil sample kind of sifting all the way to kind of annual conferences like this as well. So we like to keep tabs on the number of hours that they volunteer for, and this is mostly so that we can reward them for their time and their efforts. So for the silver, sorry, I've gone wrong colour already. The bronze award is 15 hours. The silver award is 30 hours. And the gold award is 50 hours or more. And we have 2 awards to give out today. Dee, would you like to give me a hand? The first award is a lovely gold award that goes to Elizabeth. So is Elizabeth still in the room? Yeah. Elizabeth gets one of John Drury's books and the highly coveted BIFoR hoodie. And Elizabeth has done, I think it's over 50 now, over 50 hours of volunteering for BIFoR. And the final awards, last but by no means least,